Well, everybody, welcome so much to another webinar we got with Water Stories and Sustainable Design Masterclass. We've done a few with Natalie, but everyone we've done has been mind-blowing because she's been sharing her work that really there's not a lot of people who have such just mind-blowing examples of on the ground in the MENA region. So quick rules for the webinar. We're going to do, first of all, we got the webinar lined up for about an hour, followed by Q&A. So we can answer questions in the background, but if you really want to get your questions answered by Natalie, you might want to save that to the end. So Zach's going to introduce Natalie Topa, and then we're going to get started.
Super excited for our webinar today. These webinars with Natalie are always a highlight. So as we're going, you can enter your questions into the question and answer for Natalie at the end. Like Raleigh mentioned, we'll get to them then. Natalie is really, I think, one of my very favorite practitioners in the world of water because of the energy that she brings to the table, the excitement, the enthusiasm, and the on-the-ground results with really simple, logical things that are accessible to everyone. And we were just talking before about how, everyone wants the recipe, but the recipe doesn't really work. It's not about the recipe. It's about understanding your local situation and working with it. And I think she's one of the very best at helping communities in some of the toughest situations do that very thing. So really excited to have her on the webinar today, and take it away, Natalie.
Thank you so much, Zach and Raleigh, and thank you both for your role, not only in the work that you do on the ground, but also with creating these opportunities to share out stories for people like me who are trying to, do our best and do this work in a simple way. Let me just share my screen. Does that work?
Yeah, it looks great.
You can see my screen.
Perfect.
Okay. So, yeah, thanks again for the intro. My name is Natalie Topa, and I have been living in East Africa for the last 20 years. My background is actually urban and regional planning, and I moved to South Sudan in 2005 to work on post-war town planning and reconstruction. And during the 4 years that I lived in a tent in a mango forest on the Nile River, I was very subjected to a lot of forces of nature that really helped me to understand that a lot of the challenges that we face as humans right now in the face of climate change and massive collapse of ecosystems is a design exercise. So I currently work with the United Nations World Food Program as the Global Advisor for Regenerative Resilience. The WFP, the World Food Program, is the largest humanitarian agency in the world. So, say what you want about the UN, about blah, 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 but the truth is that at the end of the day, if there's a massive flood in Pakistan or a huge disaster or war or conflict, WFP does come in with emergency food, and the focus is on making sure that humans are food secure from a day-to-day basis. But in addition to that, we have actually two pillars. One is the saving lives pillar, and the other is changing lives pillar. So it's not enough to just look at emergencies, but it's about looking also at the productive potential of landscapes and what can we do as WFP to support those landscapes to ensure that they'll provide food security for vulnerable communities for the long term. I work within a unit that's called Asset Creation. We just changed it, Asset Creation, Livelihoods, and Regenerative Practices. So within the WFP context, a lot of the work that we do with building roads, a lot of road building, infrastructure, granaries, ponds, dams, you name it, community infrastructure that supports food systems. So I'm going to take us through just a presentation that, it's just a tiny snapshot of the work that I'm involved in, but I wanted to sort of paint a picture from my perspective about climate change and the difference between climate change and land degradation, and then take us through a few examples of how I'm trying to work with communities and our staff and partners to just create some basic principles and guidelines on how to design for enhancing the productive potential of those landscapes. So climate change, there are many people who will deny that climate change is real, but I think that in the 65 countries that I've been to globally, there are definitely examples in every context of changes, shifts. This right here is just an example in Sudan. Now, Sudan and South Sudan are two totally separate countries. And this is in Sudan, which is the northern Sudan. And I just wanted to show that, you know, what I call the Saharification of Sudan is really this creeping down of the Sahara Desert. When you look at really what's happening on the ground, some people will blame climate change for the desertification, the aridity, the extreme temperatures, the drought. But looking at a bird's eye view, you can really see that how people have been growing food and using modern technology and tillage and chemical farming is creating a collapse. It's creating a collapse in the entire system that would otherwise support life, biodiversity, food. So this is just one example. You can see farms and how people are they clear land. And this is not a blame game, right? I'm not blaming the victim. This is a global human problem. Humans around the world, without the understanding of the interconnectedness of our living planet, are doing things that impact the important cycles that we are tied to. So you have farming here that is just creating very dry conditions. I make a distinction between evaporative farming and hydrative farming. I would say that conventional chemical farming is evaporative, and the work we're trying to do in agroecology, regenerative agriculture, permaculture is hydrative, protecting soil moisture and water security. This is South Sudan. This is in the area of Wau Town, Warab State. And this is just an example of how a Dinka family would live. They have their mud hut, their footpaths that go from one homestead to another. You can see a lot of animal tracks. But really what you can see here is you get the sense that the land is parched, it's dry, it's brittle. And many of the people in South Sudan are actually agro-pastoralists. So aside from just grazing their animals in the land, they are attempting to grow sorghum, millet, which are ancient grains, all of those very local native indigenous foods. But that is becoming less and less viable. Fodder and grazing land, viable grazing land, is becoming less and less viable because of the way that people manage animal energy in the landscape, but also because of climate change. Temperatures are getting hotter. It's a feedback loop with land degradation and climate change. So in South Sudan also, we have floods. So I want to just zoom out for a minute and talk about the Nile River Basin. The Nile River Basin is a watershed that includes several countries: Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Egypt. Every single thing that happens in that watershed impacts the watershed. South Sudan, especially the greater Upper Nile region, like Upper Nile State, Jonglei State, are the sump of that watershed. They're at the low point. So a lot of people are talking now about climate change and why this area is flooded. But I've been working in South Sudan for 20 years. And every time I go back and I see the swelling of the Nile River, I know that that is not only because of climate change, but because as we have these growing metropolises within the Nile River Basin, Nairobi, where I live, is expanding hugely. Everything is becoming asphalted, concrete, high-rise buildings. And that means more runoff because it means removing the impervious, spongy surfaces that would otherwise hold water higher up in the landscape. So when we have that unzipping, I love when Javin Bernakovich says we're unzipping the watershed. When we unzip the watershed and we're releasing all of this water, which would otherwise stay higher up in the landscape because of tree systems and structured soils and vegetation, now all of that water is floating to the bottom of the sump that is in this area. So not only do we have, extreme events with water, but also that that basic gravity, right? As I mentioned just before we started the call to Raleigh and Zach, I feel like a lot of times my job is just walking around explaining gravity to adults. This is the low point, and if everyone else in the watershed is releasing water, it's going to collect in the lower part. This is actually in Bentiu, in Unity State. And this is a very unique situation where we are experiencing both drought and flood at the same time. And I say that because the entire area has become flooded. So the UN and many other actors are coming in and creating this island, building up a dike constantly to protect the communities and the population that have come in from the flooded areas with their animals onto this island. The island, though, is totally ridden with drought. So we have total flood and total drought in the same place at the same time. Many of the communities within South Sudan are pastoral. Animals mean everything to those communities: social status, wealth, livelihoods, food security, milk, blood, meat. That is, that is what people consume. So here we are on the left side on the island where there's no grass at all. Everything has been grazed down to the bone. It cannot support livestock. You can see the hip bones and the ribs of these animals. But on the right side, the flooded conditions have totally decimated the grazing land. There's no grass for the animals. So it's just so painful to see where there's so much water available, the animals are starving, and that these conditions are side by side in one place. Here's a shot of dead animals. So devastating loss to livestock, livelihoods, and food security. And I really need to underline food security because the work that I really am focused on is how do we support long-term viable food and nutrition security through the design measures that we apply. In that same island, drought island, there's huge evidence of massive deforestation. People need the wood and tree wood for building their houses. The kraals, which is like a corral, a pen area for the animals, for domestic fuel, firewood, all of that. So I'm in this landscape that is covered in, it's just all you can see is tree stumps. And the only remaining tree is this one, is the one of which you can see the shadow here. And just in one, I'm standing in this stance. On the right side in the open landscape, we have 63 degrees Celsius. So that's like times 2 plus 30 is what, 150 something. That's a very, very high temperature for soil. Don't forget, the word humus comes from the word human word comes from the word humus. We humans are soil organisms. Soil should be around the temperature that humans are. So 150 plus, degrees is not an environment where soil organisms can feed life and grass and trees and shrubs. Conversely, in the shade of this one tiny little tree trunk, the temperature is 40 degrees. That's 23 degrees Celsius. I don't know if Raleigh or somebody wants to make the calculations and put them in the chat from Celsius to Fahrenheit, but that is a major difference. And that really speaks to how we can create microclimate. This whole landscape is not viable anymore to grow fodders and grasses, but it's not because of climate change and drought. It's because of the total razing and denuding of land of vegetated cover and microclimate. So I was in Iraq for most of July, and Iraq is a very complex, amazing place. Mesopotamia, this is the birthplace of many of, humanity's breadbaskets. And it was just so incredible to be there. People are amazing, wonderful, hospitable. And we went to go see how they're growing food in different contexts. And here on the left side, our team was so proud because they've shifted with a champion farmer to pilot zero tillage. So my hand here represents the property boundary. On the left side, they're doing tillage, and on the right side, they're doing zero tillage. And you really can't see much of a difference. It doesn't look like that much of a difference, but they are really trying to protect the soil organic carbon and folding that back into the soil. And I did check the temperatures. I didn't put it here because otherwise the presentation would get too long. But there is a marked difference between the area, the soil in the zero tillage area and the tillage area. However, so many of the farmers, they are not at all paying attention to contour. So here I am with a bunch of men, which is like the story of my life. I'm kind of in a lot of contexts where often I'm the only woman. And here I just asked the gentleman to line up on contour. I give my eye level to this gentleman, and 1, 2, 3, I was the 4th point on elevation. And you can see here where the actual contour is of the land versus where the direction of the plowing and the tractor furrows. So just even if they did nothing else, the zero tillage plus contour based, plowing is just a small step in the right direction. Here is an example of a broad scale olive orchard in Iraq that our team is supporting. And if you take a look at this picture on the left, I asked the team, what do you see here? What do you see? And they're like, drought. We don't see anything other than dead soil and bad conditions. Oops. But obviously we have major evidence that water is flowing through the site. In fact, this wet spot is from a solar pumping tank that overflowed and is going in the direction of the water flows. So it's always important to look at the evidence. Zach, we were just talking before the call about how to train people's eyes. Like, obviously, there are major water events that are big enough that they actually are carving pathways into the landscape. So I'm working now with the Iraq team. I just made this on my phone, but I'm working on my my guidelines report for them now. But even if we just take these rows that they've designed, and we can't take them on contour because already they're off contour. But if we were able to dig trenches that are leveled at the bottom, we can still slow spread and sink that water to hydrate and create a soakage zone that will make the olives not only more viable, but will get the acidic rainwater, which is so important, into the soil. And I want to say for a minute that in Iraq, people are talking constantly about salt. There are 3 main salts: the alkalinity of the soil, the alkalinity of the groundwater that they're pumping up and applying onto the salted soils, and then they're adding salted fertilizers. This is just sort of the way that people do things in Iraq, really focusing on external inputs and synthetic fertilizers, but those are salt-based. So, one of the recommendations for our team is just to designate every 3rd or so row as a Quranic food forest. We can have a linear green belt and do this alley cropping. And if you look at the Holy Quran, all of the things that are listed in there, dates, date palms, pomegranates, citrus, you name it. There's so many things that could be part of an alley cropping system. Oops. And these are some images that I got from Jeff Lawton online. So imagine if we just every 3rd belt, by the way, sorry, this is also barley farming. In between the olives, there are barley crops that will be grown. So respecting that we need, this is mechanized farming, that is the name of the game in Iraq. Maintaining the spacing for the machines and the turning radii at the end of every row will still allow for these green belts to be integrated. So again, I just did this with my finger on the phone. I'm developing our full report for the Iraq team. We were in Bashika, in one area that is growing olives, and 68 degrees temperature, 68, let's say it's 70 times 2 is 140 times 2 plus 30. So we're talking about, what did I say? Almost 170 degrees for soil temperatures. Impossible. Organisms in the soil just go dormant at that point. But here you can see this shaded area up above. When I check the difference, that's 43 degrees. That is a huge difference in the soil temperatures. So what that means is that we can actually modify the temperatures of the soil and promote the health of soil organisms by creating those conditions that are shaded and cooler. I also had the huge privilege going with our team to the historic Mesopotamian marshes in Iraq. It was, I was on the verge of tears the whole time. It was just so amazing to be with ancient Sumerians. We read about this in our history books. So these are ancient Sumerian people who continue to live on these islands in the massive marshes, which is thousands, hundreds of thousands of acres. It's a huge ecological zone within Iraq. You can Google it. But for, 10,000 years, people have been living off of water buffalo. And the milk and yogurt and the ferments that they make from those water buffalo, and the reeds they use to make houses, they use that for firewood. Reeds, reeds and cows are like the two big things here that can build resilience. But the marshes are drying up. And there is a very real reality around transboundary conversations that I really hope can happen in the future. If you look at the Euphrates River coming from Turkey, anything that happens in the lower point in this watershed, like in these marshes, is going to be impacted by things that are happening beyond the political boundaries in Turkey and Kurdistan, wherever, but whatever humans are doing or not doing higher up in the watershed is going to impact the lower parts. So the water is reducing, the levels are reducing, the water is becoming more alkaline, and the animals are not even able to drink the water in some seasons when it gets so salted. It's really devastating. I mean, I could cry. I probably did cry while I was there because I was very moved. I have a YouTube video, by the way, on my YouTube channel, which is just Natalie Topa, where I made a little video on this. But here the water buffalo are kept inside, and I had the most ancient meal of my life, this wheat flatbread with the luscious, amazing yogurt, fatty yogurt from the buffalo milk. So that was just to kind of highlight the different types of extremes that I encounter in many different countries, and just to really reinforce climate change is extraordinarily real, but so is land degradation and so is gravity. So everything is super interconnected. This is just a depiction of a collapsed watershed. What is a collapsed watershed? Water is being released, it's ripping off fertile topsoils, biodiversity is lost, soil is crusted, and this situation is not recharging groundwater into the aquifers, it's releasing carbon, and we know, if you've seen Kiss the Ground or any other film or documentary or scientific report, soils that go dormant are releasing carbon, and so by really reinstating the health of agroecosystems, we are doing climate change adaptation through mitigation. So a system that is healthy, it's intact, it's infiltrating water, it's promoting the growth of vegetation and deep root systems, perennial stability, is going to be inhaling carbon, and it's going to help communities, animals that are within that system to thrive and be far more resilient and buffered from extreme events. On that note, we have this climate change conversation a lot with my work, but basically, if you have a totally degraded landscape, denuded, parched, crusted, you can have a normal rain event that will be expressed as an extreme event on the ground. Conversely, if you have an intact, thriving, biodiverse agroecosystem, if there are extreme events, they will be experienced in a lesser, in a less violent way because of all of that, resilience that the entire system brings. So I want to just underscore that point. So just to really simplify things, when I work with farmers, communities, women, households, homesteads, our teams, our partners, local government, I just try to break things down by saying that there are three main thieves of water. Those three thieves of water are, number one, slope, right? The topography of the land that carries away not only water, because water doesn't run free and clear and clean, it's taking with it organic material, silt, and the fertility of that landscape. So it's carrying leaves and feathers and, dead insects and leaves and sticks and seeds. And so that is why when we design, we're always trying to design in response to the natural pattern and the natural flow of energy and nutrient flows in the landscape. Contour-based design, swales, half moons, there are so many that we'll talk about. Sun and wind both can be thieves of water. So high temperatures, baking hot sun that's exposed to the elements, wind, all of these can cause erosion. I mean, excuse me, evaporation. So these are three main things that we want to keep in mind when we are designing any system, whether it's a tiny little, edge of a refugee shelter in a camp or an IDP camp, or at a homestead, a farm, or a landscape. So just really quickly on design, just to break it down in a simple way. If you work in the humanitarian or NGO sector, you'll definitely recognize that there's some baking hot black water tank elevated. And here, I want to show that the west sun, the evening sun, is the hottest sun of the day. So you have a situation where you have a water tank that's being baked and hot, it's evaporating water, and then it's leaking. Oftentimes they're, filled up by water trucking or pumps, and oftentimes they overspill and flood. And then you have a situation where you have a collection of wet water that becomes some, as I say, like a Disneyland of disease. It's just a funky, gross puddle that's stinky, and you wouldn't want to lick it, full of flies and who knows what. Now, on the right, we have a situation where we might paint that water tank white, cool it down so it's not evaporating so much, create an obstruction to intercept those very hot temperatures, especially of the west evening sun. That's the hottest sun of the day. Now we've created a tiny little water harvesting point so that water won't run away. It's collecting in the ground, covering it with mulches and cover crops, and then, the shade and microclimate of shrubs and other perennials maybe, and then perhaps a vine that crawls and creeps all over the tank to add another layer of protection. So, this is just a simple way of showing how we can tweak a few small things in a very low cost manner often to turn a situation from destruction to production, floods into food, something disgusting into something appealing. So wherever you are, Costa Rica, Corvallis, talking to Raleigh and Zach, wherever you are, there are waste streams. Those waste streams are resource streams, food waste, animal waste, slaughter waste. By the way, I think slaughter waste is, sorry for vegetarians and vegans, but when an animal is processed and you have all of that nutrient that may not go into use, the hooves, the skins, whatever that might be, the intestines, depending on which culture you're in, are all resources. So here we've got food waste, carton boxes and paper waste, charcoal dust, which can also be biochar, depending on how it's pyrolyzed, animal manures, sticks and twigs, crop debris, leafy, greens, paper waste, ash. All of these are resource streams that can go into building healthy living soils that are well structured and maintain moisture in the land. So this is just a very quick example about from South Sudan, where I was last December. And, I know a lot of permaculture people are very swale centric, and like swale is, is the end all be all. But, in context like this, you have to meet people where you are. This is a farm of cassava, which is manioc and tapioca. I don't know what the other names are. Oops. So this was an existing farm, and people depend on this food. It's the rhizome, it's a root, it's like a starchy root vegetable. The leaves also are edible in some cultures. In East Africa, Burundi, Rwanda, they eat the leaves as well. But, you come to this farm, you can't just be like, oh, we're going to design and make a bunch of zones. Not relevant. These are the plants, this is the spacing, this is what we have to work with. So retrofitting, just making some small modifications, helping people to understand that creating water harvesting structures around the existing perennials or semi-perennials, will help to harvest water, feed that plant, and create a soakage zone. And then once you start to integrate also other perennial stability, bananas, papayas, mangoes, pigeon peas, now we start to get a shade and a dappled shade that can help protect the soil and the crop. Adding mulches, integrating organic mulches. I always tell people that the soil is a stomach, and every day that stomach needs ugali or rice or injera or enzima or whatever, fufu, depending on which culture you're in. You've got to feed starch and carbon to that soil to digest it, metabolize it, and turn it into nutrient. So then here we've got, the perennial stability, we've got mulches, and now integrating cover crops, which is very easy in many of the contexts where I work because people grow pumpkins, melons, different gourds and things that create that umbrella on the soil to provide extra protection. Oops. No software update right now. So here's an example of just a very quick and dirty design example. And I know I've showed this, Raleigh, in previous presentations, but this is the house of Regina. She lives outside of Kakuma refugee camp. She's part of the host community, which is the Turkana tribe. They are pastoralists. This was Regina's house. It's a mud house with a thatched roof. And she was experiencing a lot of flooding. When there's a big rain event, it would come into her house. She's not very tall, but it would come up to her mid-thigh. So just looking at this, one of the first questions we ask is, where's the west sun? That is the brightest, hottest, most hostile sun of the day. So if we know it's on this side, we know by virtue that the shaded, cooler side is the side that's on the east side, protected by her house from the west sun. So already we know we have a shaded microclimate. That's the perfect place to start to do some leafy green vegetables to enhance her nutrition security. We know that the water is flowing downhill. We know that there's flooding. We know that she tosses her gray water from the kitchen outside of the house. And so basically what we did is we created this design that responds to those simple, assessment points that we had gathered. So we made a very simple bioswale on contour. So for those who are not aware, a bioswale on contour, or a swale, is a long, skinny, temporary pond or trench that has, it's the same elevation along its entirety. And then the spillway, we made it away from the house to protect her home. Now, this water that collects is temporary. It's going to soak and sink. Water will always go downhill. We want that to happen under the soil and not on top of the soil. So this water that you see here is going to feed the garden beds that we made at her house, which are double dug beds, around 60 centimeters deep, packed full of organic material. And here we used a stone mulch. Why would we use a stone mulch? Because we had stones. If you don't have stones, don't use stones. Okay. Use locally available free on-site materials. So this helps to protect the moisture so it doesn't get totally evaporated by the sun. We created a fence line around the house to protect from all the thieves of water. So these thieves of water are protected through, we've mitigated the runoff, we're mitigating the temperature from the sun and wind evaporation. So slow spread and sinking the water is what we're trying to do here. What is the opposite of slow spread and sink? Fast, superficial, or on the surface. Fast, incisive, on the, cutting, gullies and erosion, and then only being on the surface. So the opposite of that is what we want to do. This is another example in the house of Denisa. Denisa is in Tanzania. This is Denisa's house, and pay attention to this little kitchen here. This is her thatched kitchen area. She was growing cassava with chemicals, pesticides, tilling, and all of her soil was leaving her farm. It was losing fertility. So we did this training actually with Warren Brush and our team members when I was with the Danish Refugee Council. We wanted to stop the runoff from her roof, from higher up in the mountain, and create this entire food forest using half moons. And in every half moon, we planted a long-term overstory tree, but we also added shorter-term things like bananas and papayas, respecting the concept of time and place. A mango is going to take a very long time to grow, but bananas and papayas won't. So, you were just playing with all of the opportunities in that space. We created these bio swales on contour. We actually are harvesting water from a nearby gully that used to be a footpath. And you can see here 1, 2, and 3 swales, hydrating, like creating throats in the landscape to swallow and quench that land. So after only one rainy season, Denisa, who was pregnant at the time of the training, had this little baby named Natalie. But you can see here the tree baskets of the food forest that we had planted. She had this explosion of growth. This was during COVID. And for the first time, she had pure food security, seed security. We only brought seeds that she can save and multiply and share of local indigenous leafy green vegetables. And after 1.5 years, remember her kitchen I mentioned? So you can see this landscape is denuded, dry, parched. You would think that you're like in the highlands of Ethiopia. And here you might think you're, in the jungles of Congo. This food forest exploded and just became this rich, biodiverse, abundant system. And she mentioned she had more insects than ever before, but less pest damage than ever before, because all of these actors in the ecosystem are balancing themselves out. Yeah, so. So moving on to Sudan. If you are not living under a rock, you may know that there's a horrific war currently in Sudan. And just before that war, I went with the Norwegian Refugee Council to conduct various trainings in Sudan. And one of the things that we did was to create a sponge homestead at the home of a woman called Hawa. What I call a sponge homestead is a place that is really a home for water that is passing through, infiltrates and is stored in the spongy organic material and in the interstitial spaces in the soil. That's what we call green water, storing water in the soil, which is the largest and cheapest storage tank that we have for water. So very quickly, and looking again at those 3 thieves of water, if you looked at, okay, this is obviously not to scale, I just sketched this, but if an aerial view of Hawa's homestead, you would see that the sun, the west sun, is setting on the right side. We're not doing a north true situation here. The sun is coming from this side. Oops. Then we have the wind coming from this direction and the flows of water coming from this direction. So just with this information, we can start to put together a design. The first step that we did was to do a sponge demo with the community, with Hawa, her neighbors, who are agro-pastoralists. They grow sorghum and they also have ruminant livestock. Here we just made a very mock farm that has water harvesting earthworks, that has some stones, that has trees and biodiversity, and then we mulched it completely. And then we had a second mock farm, which is sort of the modern agriculture practices that people have been practicing, which is where they till all the land, they gather up all their crop debris at the end of the season, and they set it on fire. And then we pour water on both of those 2 farms side by side. And the next day we clock it with a temperature gun. We can see the temperatures are lower underneath those mulches. Already insects and termites are taking that organic material and breaking it down into fertility. So that's one little exercise we do with the communities. So what we did here at Hawa's homestead, you can see she had sorghum and kerkede, which is hibiscus, which is used for tea, and also the leafy greens are also edible leafy green vegetable. So we cleared this land first, and then with our A-frame that we made, we started to just do window shopping for contour. So you can see here 1, 2, 3, 4, just around every 2 or 3 meters, we just measuring the contour. It's free, it's non-committal. For those who fear commitment, you can just do this all day long. And we started to understand what was emerging was the pattern of the landscape. So then once we have an indication of the flows of water, then we can start to do some design. Obviously, there are other ways that we are informed about the opportunities on the site. This is a goat pen that Hawa had. There was a bathroom, a hammam, which has urine and shower water flowing off. There were hot zones, where the sun is just baking the land, and there's really no respite for her family under any trees or anything. They're just subject to this open, hot, baking land. So every single thing that we did was to capture water from roof lines, the gray water from the house. This is actually a banana circle. So this goat nutrient would flow into this half moon that would then flow into this longer swale and spread that nutrient across her compound. So we did 2 main swales, a lot of half moons for trees and food forestry. and double dug beds, which I'll show you. So this is Hawa. She's making her A-frame, using all materials that are locally available from carpenters. So really nothing imported, the knowledge is the main input here. And then one of the champions from the community, I just gave him the temperature gun. And this is something I do, is just to go and, ask people to go and explore, check the temperatures all over the compound in the morning and in the evening. And what do you observe? So the areas that are very, very hot in the evening, we want to mitigate with trees, with trellises. So this is Hawa's homestead. This is that longer swale, which is, okay, I would not shape it quite so channelized, but whatever, we did what we could. I would make it more smooth and open and beveled. But this is the longer swale where the goat manure dumps into, and it exits here. So we actually had 2 swales, and this was really such an amazing example of creating the longest, slowest path of water before it leaves the landscape. So we had 2 swales interconnected, and all of these dump out into this food forest of half moons that spill and fill in a controlled way from one to the next. It's cascading and really allowing that water to infiltrate before it exits the system. So here's another view. These just pay attention to these garden beds, because I'm going to show you how we made those. So this is the first long swale that spills into the second swale. We don't align the spillways because that's too much concentrated energy of water in a big event. But these are some of the beds that we started to make. And this is how we make those beds. We dig deep, 50 to 60 centimeters below the surface, and fill them with whatever we can find. Browns and greens. Browns being carbonaceous materials, paper waste, carton waste, leaves, dried grasses, sticks, twigs, dried manures. And then the greens, things like more fresh manures, compost, food waste, green leaves, green organic matter. And then we return the soil on top, and we break it up with our hands, all those clods of mud, and make it very fine, and add another little finishing layer of compost, which I'll show you in a minute. So this is just another example of sort of the finishing touches. So bringing in some stones to reinforce our little half moons. So the idea is, like, here you have a planting hole for a tree, water will collect here, and the roots will be able to access that, using stones for silt traps and stone mulches. Inside here, this is a stone mulch, adding organic material. This is sorghum stalks and other, grassy weeds from nearby that we put inside the bioswale, which will break down, while also, well, actually, we really packed the swales here because there are small children. So we wanted to have a bouncy mulch that would create a buffer in case that thing is full. Nobody would, get stuck in that swale. Integrating vertical structures, right? I always talk about the Garden of Eden or Jannah. If you think about the Garden of Eden, do you think of a field of wheat that is harvested and left to be brown and dry, and fallow for the rest of the year? Or do you think about an apple tree and orchards and fruits and perennial stability and microclimate and cool shaded places with lots of food and fruit and biodiversity? So that is a 3-dimensional vision. And that vision, here we can start to, create that by creating vertical structures, trellises, which are growing surfaces. So, if you have a vining pumpkin or passion fruit or beans over this trellis, that's going to add additional shade and protection from evaporation over this little bioswale. So lots and lots of mulches, right? Going back to the 3 thieves of water, I always tell farmers, if your eyes can see that soil, the sun's eyes can see that soil, and the sun's eyes are sucking the moisture straight out of your soil. And creating hot conditions that soil organisms can't thrive in. So here we planted trees, and we've protected them with some, like, burlap, I guess you call it in English, burlap bags. But we only planted the number of trees that Hawa and her family were able to water, because we were heading into the dry season. And so she said she can handle X number of trees. And then we made these garden beds that we planted very biointensively, because we added so much fertility to the bottom of the garden bed that plants don't need to vertically compete with each other. They can just go straight down and access what they need. So you can plant vegetables, 10 centimeters for kales and leafy greens, 10, 15 centimeters. and then you don't have to dig this garden bed again for another 5 years if it has so much fertility. So here, how I was planting, I only brought seeds that can be reproduced and multiplied and adapted and shared. I would never give somebody GMOs and hybrid and improved seeds because they are literally designed in many cases to not reproduce and to be used with chemicals. And I don't find that ethical, and I don't find it resilience building. I would say that's vulnerability building. So after this planted, here we added a lot of mulch, and we opened the mulch. This is too mulched, but we did open the mulch so that the lines that we marked with these sticks would be exposed so that the little seed could get out of the ground. So now the dry season hit, bone dry, totally parched. I mean, totally desiccated, brittle landscape. You can see with your eyes. It's like you would not want to, be laying out in a bikini in this in this compound. But in that tiny little garden bed, that we put a little shade structure over, and how I used just recycled materials from her compound, like this mosquito net. And inside that tiny little garden bed, you had the enabling environment, the conditions, the microclimate, the deep soil bedding and moisture retention, so that food was actually viable and she can access nutrients even in the dry season. So that is what, that's what we're trying to create with these systems that we design. This is obviously a nanoscale, but, had the war not started, and to be honest, we don't know what happened with Hawa because we've not been able to access her or be in touch with her family since the war started. So I don't have any pictures to show a follow-up, but that's the reality also of doing the work that we do, is putting, investing energy and time and resources to support people who are in very vulnerable conditions for different reasons. And it may or may not work. It may fail. You may never hear from them. You may have a war breakout. Who knows? I put this slide to say that no food security without seed security. Okay. Not possible. I don't know what else to say about that. People and women have been saving and selecting seeds, and as Dr. Vandana Shiva, my friend and mentor, always says, the intelligence of nature and the intelligence of farmers have been partnering for hundreds and thousands of years to adapt seeds locally so that they have a resilience to the local conditions. So just to shift a little bit, we also, within the World Food Program, we do something, we hold these boot camps on ecosystem restoration with universities, with local government, with local partners. And, we spend 2 weeks where we go through this entire exercise. I'm just giving you a little snapshot. But basically, this is here in Kenya in a highly degraded landscape. I mean, if you can't see, it's just melting away. All the soil is leaving the entire place like a sandcastle that a wave just hit. It's just washing away. This is also an area that is pastoral, and it's an area that is becoming increasingly prone to conflict. If you have livestock and animals, you need water and you need grass and you need viable grazeland, and you can't have that if your pasture land is melting away. So in this landscape, we did a lot of different steps. I won't go through everything, but we work with the community to do a mapping. And actually this image is from Malawi, but just to show you, we put down a whole bunch of materials, sticks, twigs, leaves, bottles, whatever that might be. And we separate the women and men, and each group will make a map of their community. And this is what that can look like. So, oftentimes the women tend to be very, 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 very detailed. They have an incredibly intimate knowledge of every single borehole, water point, school, farm, garden. And the men tend to have a larger kind of regional view. They'll know the markets from the nearby watershed, and very interesting to see the differences. But here in the right-hand side, left is Malawi, just to show you what that community map looks like. They all do also highlight erosion, environmental challenges that they have. Here on the right-hand side, this was in Kenya at this ecosystem restoration boot camp. And you can see these brown lines here indicate where major gully formation and massive, gullies and erosion are taking place. So in this boot camp, we worked with the community and did many different types of human scaled earthworks and stoneworks. And again, going back to, permaculture and how oftentimes design can be very swale centric. I'm just want the world to know that there are many other options for different reasons. You cannot have a contiguous long swale where you have livestock, okay? Animals, elephants, we have elephants here. We have camels, we have goats, cows, that they don't give a fart about your berm or your design or your spillway. They will trample that, and where they trample those earthen structures, you can have a weak point, and that can, I know this because it's happened to me in northern Kenya, not here, but in another place, a massive gully erosion very, very quickly. So a huge gully formed where we did a big swale and the animals were not respecting our design. So we're looking here at stone line bunds. So this is a form of terracing. So creating terraces on contour with, no, sorry, not terraces, stone bunds on contour that will capture so much silt that it will eventually terrace off. We're doing, micro basins around trees. The higher part of the mountain is very stony and steep. You'll also, earthworks have to be appropriate to the slope and the soil conditions. So this is just another view, more stone line bunds, which will become terraces, gully reshaping. We did have an excavator with us. So the aim was to just show a number of different types of technologies, as we call them, or strategies, types of earthworks and stoneworks that the community can actually carry forward. So this is just another view, stone line bunds, different basins. We did a trench at the break of slope with the excavator. So many different types. You've got gabion cages here that people are making gabions in some of those deep gullies. No comment on that. I have mixed feelings about the gabions. So again, here, earthworks mixed with stoneworks, large half moons. And actually, I've learned so much since joining WFP. We have amazing experts, and some of my colleagues I'm so lucky to work with, agricultural engineer Jonathan from Ethiopia, and others, Voli Karuchi, who, we've all been doing different things for many years, and now we come together and are learning from each other all the time. It's very exciting. But there are many different types of modifications you can make to half moons. If you have clay soil and water collects in that center and becomes anaerobic, you can't grow your sorghum there, right? So you can have a modified pit where you can grow the sorghum or your fodder grasses, have different adaptations for water harvesting in trees. So this is just one tiny example of the many different forms that I've learned about since joining WFP. So here's just a little drone shot of a section of the area where we were working. This upper part is a mistake. Communication is really key in some of these trainings, but we had a junior person who just told the excavator to come and rip up all this land. That was not the point. We weren't trying to rip up that land and loosen it. But anyway, many different types of structures. And also within that same training, we now went to the homestead of Priscilla. In fact, Priscilla is this champion woman. She's sort of an elder in the community. And one of the reasons that we selected this community is because she and her sons were trying, with futile efforts to do tiny little earthworks and stoneworks to try to hold back the major erosion of their community. And we knew that because there's this effort already, it's much easier to jump onto a moving bus. And she was in motion, trying whatever possible. So this is the homestead of Priscilla. She did have a tiny area that had a lot of trees and she would grow vegetables under that. So I said, let's extend that food forest feeling, that microclimate. You can't really see very well here, but the water flows from where this guy is down towards this shed. That's the direction of flow of water. So we started to design a garden with Priscilla and the community with many different types of structures, compost pits, banana circles, half moons for growing and creating just major hydration and soakage. We did a bioswale, which here we're protecting local materials to create a sort of green corridor, lots of mulches inside and around, on top of the berms, all over. Oops. that's not the title of the slide. So here at the end, we've got just massive mulch. We're really trying to create a sponge that will hold and retain moisture and water in the system long after the rain ends. As I said, a lot of the agriculture we have here is rain fed, but the second the rain stops, the moisture is gone. And what we're trying to do is bank all that moisture and water in the soil so it can continue to feed annual and perennial crops even after the rains end. And on that note, gray water is something, I didn't include it very much here. Here in many parts of Africa, we have a rainy season and we have a dry season, but we don't have a shower season or a dishwashing season. That's every day. So every day you have availability of these small amounts of water that when, protected in a microclimate and covered with mulches and cover crops are very viable to grow fruit trees, leafy green vegetables, and nutrient-dense foods for the family. So this is the little sponge homestead that you can see, from an aerial view. So the water flows from the bottom here towards the top, and we're just trying to, create these security checkpoints. We don't want super highways of water flowing through. We want parking lots. Where water accumulates, life generates, and that is where fertility and long-term, viability of annual and perennial crops can happen. This is just another view. So here we've got half moon, compost pit, half moon. All of these berms can be planted. Same with the inside with, bananas and papayas. These are the double dug beds. Here's the bioswale. And I don't have actually after photos because the only ones I have are sent by Priscilla on WhatsApp and the resolution is not great, but 90% of the people who were in that training with us have now taken those design concepts to their homes and are actively growing vegetables and nutrient-dense crops around the home, even using gray water. So that was a huge success. And then also that same community, after we left the boot camp training, that community has been working every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for 4 hours a day to continue all of the earthworks on the mountain to, stop the erosion. They've done what's called an area closure. They have a social contract that no animals will graze there, nobody will deforest there. So they really want to heal that hill and stop the extreme events and violent behavior of water passing through. So I'm just ending on several images. WFP in the Sahel through our Regional Bureau of Dakar is doing really groundbreaking, no pun intended, design across landscapes. So again, a lot of permaculture people might think, oh, this isn't design, it's just a bunch of half moons. I created the term lunatic, okay? Luna as in moon. So we're lunatics making half moons all over the place. Again, in livestock zones, you can't have contiguous earthworks. You need to have a modular design that if a herd of elephants or camels or cows breaks a couple of these, that's fine. The function of harvesting water deep into the soils is still going to be there, and making that viability of grazeland and fodder grasses, much more enhanced across the year. So this is in Burkina Faso. I'm not sure where this is. I've just pulled off a bunch of examples from our files, but WFP is doing this at different scales. Again, you can see the different types of design that might have zai pits on the outer edge of the berm of the half moon, different water harvesting trenches inside, places for trees, places for sorghum and millet and ancient grains. So they all have their different purposes. This is another example. I'm not sure exactly where it is, but it is from the Sahel region. So, and it's part of that Great Green Wall project. If you haven't seen our viral video that Andrew Millison made, I put a copy in the of the link in the chat. The Great Green Wall is an Africa-wide initiative to basically reinstate the green zone that is just south of the Sahara Desert. That place, because of climate change and ecological degradation, is becoming more desertified, and that Sahara Desert is crawling down. So this is our way of pushing back, partnering with nature to regreen that area and protect the whole Saharification of occurring within, the southernmost points from the Sahara. So this is again another example. So this might be Mali, Niger, Chad, Mauritania, Burkina Faso. This is Mauritania. So these are very large scale. I mean, it just looks like a bunch of half moons because we're lunatics, but these are actually spanning huge areas, huge areas. And even from satellite, you can see the difference that it's making in restoring the function of the land. And I was actually just last week in Chad with Andrew Millison, and we were doing more filming. So we had our team and Andrew and drones and capturing the breadth. This is nothing compared to what you're going to see in those upcoming videos. So this is, I think, my last slide. This is in Ethiopia. My former director and friend and mentor, Voli Karuchi, and Jonathan, who's the agricultural engineer I mentioned from Ethiopia, they were, many years ago living in Ethiopia, working with communities to restore watersheds. If you've seen Hope in a Changing Climate by John D. Liu, he features the Les Plateau, which is actually was started as a World Food Program initiative where they were working with the Chinese government to get the funding from the World Bank to implement the Les Plateau. And apparently there's like a statue memorializing or commemorating WFP inside that watershed. But in that same film, Hope in a Changing Climate by John D. Liu, he also highlights an example of Ethiopia where communities are restoring land. Based on the watershed restoration projects that our team was doing many years ago, local governments, local communities have been scaling this up. And these images are actually from the Facebook group of a local government official in Ethiopia showing the work that is continuing. And now I just want to go back again about the issue of being swale centric. Here you can see many different types of structures and firewalls, right? So you have small scale, different types of earthworks, fire pits, different types of trenches, contour-based trenches that are, kind of a modified swale, but they have a break in between. So this is really a livestock-proof design. Imagine if you only had swales and you get one weak point, you're just going to have the Grand Canyon. So, this is just a testament to, individuals out there with their shovels and one little structure at a time. And you can just imagine the impacts overall on the hydrological stabilization, the nutrient stabilization, the groundwater recharge, and the soakage and viability of food production, not only on this hill, but within the system. So that's it. That's the end of the presentation. And I just love this picture from South Sudan with my colleagues. I always tell them the nose knows when you smell the soil or compost, the nose knows. So here they are smelling some soil that was just under the mulch in one of the systems that we made. So yeah, that's it. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Amazing presentation. That was incredible. So many gems in there. I wrote a couple in the chat. Yeah, surefire awesomeness. Thanks for sharing that, Natalie.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, oh my God, the last few slides.
So
that was straight. It's funny. It's, you have these really cool 3D concept, like animated pictures at the start, and actually seeing that on the hillside at the very end. That's such a cool image to end on, and just see like that implemented in in real life. That's just awesome. So awesome.
Thanks. And just to be clear, I was not involved in that Ethiopia work. I've not been involved in the work that I showed in the Sahel. So that's not my work, but I'd really, I work with a lot of introverted engineering type of people who are not going to toot their own horn. So I'm here to, have this tootathon to really show the impact and the simple ingenuity, right? As I say, AI, I'm really into AI, not artificial intelligence, but ancient innovation. So, yeah.
Nice. I love that. Well, we've got a bunch of questions that have come in, and folks, if you want to ask your question with your voice too, you can use the raise hand function. One of the questions right off that I can see that I'm just going to answer here in the chat is like, how do we work with you, Natalie? Will you come to Costa Rica is the source of this question. And so I'm going to put in the chat here Natalie's LinkedIn, which she said is the best way to get a hold of her. So Mara, if you want to send all those details direct to Natalie, that would probably be best. And yeah, Pablo, do you want to get us started off with the question? You should be able to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
You're very low in volume right now. It's extremely quiet. Let's see.
Let me see. Plim plum plum. Testing 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, then that may unfortunately be a bit too low for us to hear you. For some reason, I hear the feedback of my microphone, but I don't hear yours, unfortunately. Well, Pablo, don't worry about it. We could try that later. You can type your question in the chat box, and it's still like
You're still very
very
quiet.
quiet, unfortunately.
Okay.
Well, let's try. Pablo, go ahead.
Sure.
I can kind of hear you.
Hi, Natalie. Hi, Zach. Super nice being here with you. I saw, Natalie, your videos and I follow your previous stuff. I've been working with Zach a lot and learning. I have a small farm in the Sequoia forest. And so your work is amazing. And I started to work helping a farm in the high desert close to Los Angeles. My first question is, what is the average precipitation in some of these places you show? And also you spoke about some fire break structures, and I would like to know more.
Yeah. So the rainfall, I mean, it can be in some cases the same as California or less. You know, I tend to use that as an example because in some of the very dry land areas where we are that are parched and drought ridden, you know, I tell people, California has the same rainfall, but California has groundwater and all those other types of infrastructure. So it really depends, Pablo, but you know, regardless of what your rainfall is, I mean, there are certain design principles, even if you're in Bali, Indonesia, and you have major rainfall, we want to have a measured distribution of water, right? Whether you have too little water or too much, you still want to design to have a controlled and measured distribution so that you're pacifying extreme water events and allowing water to gently, you know, wash over the land, collect in certain strategic areas. And then your second question was about
fire break.
Yeah, I didn't actually, maybe I said fire break, but what I meant was firewall. And what I mean is having like half moon, half moon, half moons, and then trench. Half moon, half moon, half moon, and then trench. So you're integrating different types of structures across the same landscape. Like in that last example in Ethiopia, you don't just have a uniform kind of monoculture of a certain type of earthwork, but you're reinforcing some barriers so that if your half moons are too weak, you still will have a deeper trench or another structure to sort of break that pattern and flow of water in a violent or extreme water event. So I meant more firewall, not fire break. And that's really just about having these reinforcements of different types of structure integrated.
Amazing. Briefly, the place that I've started to consult has 5 inches of rain per year. That is even less than Los Angeles. Los Angeles has around 16 inches per year. So that's why, I mean, I love the structures you build. I like that they can be built by hand, and I like they look irregular like nature.
Yeah, I mean, labor-based earthworks and machine-based earthworks all have their place. It depends on the context, the community, the resources, but you know, don't leave it to me to poo-poo a excavator.
No.
You know, so and oftentimes, we'll have machine-based earthworks, and then we have humans that come in and will do the refinement or
Yeah.
the smaller, more delicate, parts of the design. So it's really about context. Context matters. So thanks so much, Pablo. Good luck with your work.
Yeah, thanks, Pablo. It was good seeing you at the intensive. All right.
Always great to have you.
Yeah, we have Imad, Nicholas, and Daniel have their hands raised. And Reem.
Yeah, let's go a couple of those, and then we've got some really good questions that have come in through
Yep.
the Q&A
Yeah,
too.
how we gonna
Maybe
do-
Nicholas.
Okay, Nicholas.
All right. My question is regarding steeper terrains. I've noticed most of the work you've done was either on flat, semi-flat, or gently sloped terrain. But here I'm in the Andes, and the landscape is thirsty, but it is generally very steep, and is also very prone to landslide. So it'll go from not having, like, for example, right now the valley right next to us burned 8,000 hectares of just annual grass just burned because we haven't had rain in 4 months. So I'm just curious if there's any, like, how to, like, water structures that can absorb water but not absorb too much, I guess is my question.
Yeah, absolutely. So, going back to the swale centricism, that is not appropriate in steep slopes. And you have to really understand also the soil types, the geology that you're working in, and that can change from different part of the mountain. When you say Andes, I imagine rocky, parched, pebbly slopes. And that is where I would do stonework, small structures that are gentle, that are not going to pose a massive threat. So really, understanding where you've got that shaly, a lot of aggregate, using that material and on those steeper slopes, not necessarily deep, long swales or anything like that. What we do is these micro trenches. So just a deep kind of channelized trench, and not connected, not contiguous, because it's when you have those contiguous structures where that water can start to really create that lens underneath and weaken that lower part of the geology that can contribute to a landslide. So again, not having these contiguous things that are just gonna, create this like one long wet zone that can peel off a part of a mountain. And then, of course, the perennial stability. I don't know where you are in the Andes or what that timberline looks like, but perennial stability roots, the deep root netting into the hillsides, again, depending on the context, permaculture's middle name is, it depends. So I can't, I'm really just, imagining what you're talking about, but I would focus on small scale strategies, not large structures, that really respond to the material that you have, and that can change higher up on a steeper slope versus the break of slope. So the minute that grade changes on your mountain can help you decide what kind of structure will be appropriate in the steeper slope versus the break of slope and the alluvium. So it's going to be many different types of strategies. Yeah, but if you're prone to landslides, be careful.
Thank you.
All right, if we
Awesome.
do one more live question. How about Imad? He was the second person who had his hand raised. All right. Hey, Imad.
Hey, everybody. Thank you for having me on real quick. Appreciate
No worries.
it. It's definitely one that I need to listen back with a notebook and take a bunch of notes because it was just awesome. And I've never come across your work before, so I really appreciate Zach and Raleigh bringing you up. This is amazing. I'm actually a consultant for the Jordanian government. I'm Jordanian myself. I have a farm here in America, and I have a farm over there. My question is, I have a lot of degraded farmland over there, not so much in the Pacific Northwest. My question is, where do we start? Do we start when we have these extreme, really extreme landscapes, do we start with tree planting? Do I just fence everything off and let things rest? Start with some earthworks. So what would your recommendation be on, something very extreme? Where would I start?
If you're talking about the land in Jordan, I've been to Jordan, and you know that Jeff Lawton has the Greening the Desert farm there as well. So number one, start with the water. You mentioned fencing. If you can fence it, depending on how big your land is, depending on how big the animal threat is, fencing is great to protect it from all those little four-legged people that are being eaten by immigrants. Just kidding. I didn't just say that. But number one,
No, that's
start
totally
with
fine, because yeah, you're right. People will just come and graze our olive grove and just graze things, and
Yeah.
I'll plant cover crops and they'll just be gone.
So you have existing olive groves. Is that what you mean? I'm gonna.
Yes. Sorry, I'm trying
Okay.
to unmute myself.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have existing olive groves. I have existing hilltops and land. So yeah, I was just like, should I plant more? Should I,
Yes.
try to?
Yeah. Absolutely. Iowa. So number one, you need to plant the rain. Okay. So if you are talking, I assume you have a lot of stones, pebbles, sand, so like silties, loamy sands and rocks in that region, what I know of that area. So definitely start to do your passive water harvesting earthworks number one. Before you plant the crops, you plant the rain. So what that means is if you have stones, if you have ways to whether it's digging, small scale earthworks that are contour based or earthworks, definitely can Raleigh or somebody put the Greening the Desert video, from Jeff Lawton?
Yeah, for sure. I'll pop that in there.
So first do that. Then number two, Imad, what you want to do is really focus on nitrogen fixing trees, acacias, sesbanias. There's so many which are going to be appropriate to your context. Not carob. Carob is actually not a nitrogen fixer. Apparently the bacteria that converts the nitrogen was developed after. I can't remember if there's an ancient prehistoric reason why carob actually doesn't fix nitrogen. But in that video, if you know anything about Jeff Lawton and the work he's done in Jordan, for the first 3 years, the 90% of the trees that Jeff put into his system were nitrogen fixing trees. After that 3-year period, he started to chop and drop. So overplant your trees. It's much better to overplant your trees and have too many trees and too much biomass that you can manage and break down and chop down to build that forest floor. So after 3 years, he's now started to retrofit and plant now other types of, what I would call chronic species, things that are from that region. Date palms, citrus, orange, pomegranates, you name them, so many different ones. And mulch. You're constantly having to feed that soil stomach. So, olives are a bit, I don't know, maybe somebody here has opinions on olives, because I'm seeing, I know that throughout the Mediterranean regions, I saw somebody here from Cyprus, by the way. I used to live in Cyprus when I was 9 years old. Olives are said to be wanting drainage, good soil drainage, right? But when you have 68 degrees temperatures and parched land and no water, then I would say try to support those trees to have the conditions of when they were thriving the most. So, Imad, do your gentle small scale structures to, because in Jordan, rain doesn't come very often. When it comes, it's big and infrequent, large, but you want to catch as much of that water as you can into the soil. And then you want to layer in various types of measures to protect that moisture. Tree cover. Pigeon peas, by the way, are like a miracle. They grow quickly and they're nitrogenous and they're drought resistant and they're excellent fodder. When I say fodder, I mean for ruminants and pollinators. And then, be chopping down your different species, get biomass trees in there to chop them down so that you can, do that chop and drop before the rains and build that forest floor, that sponge, that carbon that's going to hold water and moisture and break down into fertility. Malesh, that's all I have to say for now. Shukran, Imad.
No, mashallah. Thank you so much. Shukran. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Ahmad. Thanks for joining. All right. Well, why don't
We got one more hand up, and then we got a bunch of questions in the Q&A.
Okay.
Daniel, if you want to give us our last live question for the moment.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we got you.
Yep.
Hello. Hello, everyone. I'm from Mexico, San Miguel de Allende, and I just have two questions. There was this project that you built a swale on top of the house. It was kind of like on the higher part of the slope.
Yeah.
That you covered with rock mulch. Was that
Yeah.
house on stilts?
No.
I don't know if if the humidity is gonna damage the house, or I don't know what your consideration is to have such a water body close to a unit.
Muy buena pregunta. So,
Thank you.
yeah, that's an excellent question because these are mud structures and moisture and mud creates, soup, mud. So that is a very good question. And yes, we have totally pooped the bed in some cases where if you saw the sponge village of Atego that Warren and I designed, we had 200 people, 6 machines. We did this whole huge design. We did road water harvesting. We brought a swale from the road into the community. That swale was very close to a mud house, which didn't destroy the house, but it made it really cold, right? Because of evapotranspiration. So if you want free air conditioning, definitely put water harvesting right next to your mud house. But it's usually cold during the it's wet during the cold season. The other thing is that there was an outhouse right there. And I guess the problem is that our design was so successful, it was actually harvesting so much water in that swale that the outhouse completely filled up, had to be backfilled, relocated, because the groundwater levels were raising so much. So absolutely, si tienes una casa de matope o lo que sea, de barro, then be very careful about putting water harvesting next to your mud house. Yes.
Would you
And that, of course,
consider
is
raising the house?
well, no, not in this environment. But it's the distance is going to depend on the soil type, right? And how quickly that water and moisture is going to transfer across distance towards your mud house, right? You could do, I guess, like a French drain. If you're into cob building and know what the French drains are, you could modify it that way. It really is going to depend on your soil type, though. And also, if somebody is making a proper cob house with plaster, it's going to be a very different level of susceptibility than the sort of mud clods that people are building, so the structure is also totally different and has a different level of structural integrity.
Thank you so much for that. And one last question. Do you work with any gray water filters before you infiltrate the water from the showers?
No. Yes. So we don't not filters per se, but we use biology to do that biological plumbing. So for example, if we're doing like a banana circle, which is just a fancy name for a hole in the ground that has a bunch of mulch in it and is surrounded by bananas or papayas. In Myanmar, we were doing with coconuts. So it's really important to understand that carbon, like mulch, grass, carton boxes, paper, all that, carbon is the food of fungi. And when fungi start to grow all over that carbon, when you pour that soapy water in there, it is biologically cleaned through the soil microbiology. Fungi lock up those salts, render them inert, and clean it biologically. So like imagine if you have a hole with, you put it, like imagine you're an African woman and you have a homestead like that one you're talking about, and you make a hole, all your household food waste, bones, potato peels can go inside that hole. You're planting around the hole. Google banana circle. Can be 2 meters wide, it can be 1 meter wide. As long as you are dumping a bunch of thick mulch of carbon on top of that, and then you pour that water inside the center of the circle, that fungi and the carbon will clean that water before it wicks to the outer spaces of that circle where your bananas and papayas and other plants are going to access it. So it's biological plumbing. We're focusing on the biology to clean that water, including soap.
I love that. Thank you so much.
Great.
Sí. Muchas gracias.
Gracias.
Gracias por tus preguntas, Daniel. Okay, yeah, let's get to some other questions, some of the typed questions. I like this one by Marius. He's asking about, you know, how are you dealing with all these languages? You got to deal with regional dialects. You got to deal with Arabic and Spanish. How are you dealing with like being able to jump from language to language?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I studied standard classical Arabic 20 years ago at the USDA Graduate School in Washington, D.C. I studied business in Spain. I studied French in Spain. So I don't know, languages, you know, we have different parts of our brain, and I've always been, is it right brain or left brain that like, you know, likes languages and communication and all that. So for me, it's more fun than anything. But generally speaking, I'm speaking English when I conduct a training and we have translators, but it does help. I mean, I will say when I was in Chad last week with Andrew Millison, you know, we had Sudanese refugees in Chad, and you had staff who speak French, but not Sudanese Arabic. You have people who speak Arabic, but not French. So it really helped that I know the main food groups that they're growing in Sudanese Arabic. It helped that I knew basic French. So learn other languages.
Yep.
Engage Duolingo.
Totally. Building on that one a little bit, one from Josh, such a wonderful presentation. Can you speak a little to your mindset when working with cultures that are unfamiliar to you? What are some good tools for meeting people where they're at from an introduction and communication perspective?
Oh, keep your eyes open and your mouth shut. I mean, I've you know, been to like 65 different countries, and I'm seeing a lot of different ways of being human. Sometimes there are a lot of gendered things that I don't agree with, things that really piss me off. But at the end of the day, I'm really focused on the biology. I'm focusing on supporting households. And so that's really the common denominator. Culturally, I'm a home chef, in case for anybody who doesn't know that. I love cooking. And for me, the second I know what the food culture is, I know a bit about where I am, right? If I'm eating hummus and baba ganoush and lamb, I have some idea about where I might be in the world. If I'm eating, you know, pork and rice noodles with mint and lemongrass juice, like that, like, so for me, food is really a window into where I am and how people grow food. It tells me about the landscape. So for me, food is a big, you know, a unifier. And otherwise, just really, you know, problem solving. I don't have all the answers. God knows. I show up to a place, people, there are problems. I just try to apply whatever kind of observations I might have, but we're really co-engineering, you know, like I'm not coming as the expert and I know everything. Well, I'm just like, okay, I have a set of ideas. You and your ancestors have been here forever. And how can we combine our, you know, our collective knowledge to apply some design solutions? And people appreciate that generally. So I've not really had major issues. But I will say sometimes the gendered stuff really it can be the most sensitive from a cultural perspective. Let me just say that.
Definitely. You've got your work cut out for you there. One from Mara. Can you talk about the insects and other pests are common problems in various regions where you're working, and how the gentling of the soil's microclimates may have introduced new pests and or responses to existing pests?
Yes. So I hope everyone here knows who Elaine Ingham is. And if not, maybe somebody can like put a link to Soil Food Web. But basically, she would say healthy plants are not going to be attacked by pests. The immune system of plants, of crops, comes from the soil. That is the biology. A healthy, thriving universe inside the soil is what provides the security system against pest infestation. That being said, living in East Africa for 20 years, we have a locust reality. I don't call them infestations because if you go to the National Museum of Nairobi, you'll see fossil locusts from 17 million years ago. So I don't think this is a new phenomenon. But what I will say is that, if nothing else, the soil is the first stop. We are farming soils. We're not farming crops. The crops are the byproduct. Those healthy living soils, when you have the right pumping of nutrients and sugars from the soil to the plant, you have bacteria that are going to protect that plant. But there are other circumstances, like I said, with locusts. If I were a farmer, in the arid region of Kenya or Somalia or Ethiopia, who is hit by locusts, I would start collecting those locusts immediately. I would ferment them, make a fermented biofertilizer. I would spray that onto the soils. I would feed them to ducks and chickens. If I don't grow ducks and chickens, I would collect them and pelletize them or pulverize them and transport them to other regions that do sell chickens. So this is just to say that, in permaculture, the concept of turning a problem into a solution, I can assure you, if you are a farmer in regions that have, onset of locusts, you just got to go with that flow. You've got to kind of play jujitsu with nature and try to make the most of that. But if you're just, if you're doing gardening, if you're doing farming in a non-locust desert, there are things that start at the soil. There are hydrolysates, fish amino acids, biofertilizers. You can make your organic things at home. There are intercropping, interplanting, companion plants that also can mitigate an infestation. It really depends on what you're talking about, but just ensuring that you have a systemic level of your system. Don't put any pesticides on, or biocides is what they are, on your crops. If people haven't read the book, Silent Spring by Rachel Carlson, a lot of times you'll hear this refrán, like that a teaspoon of soil has more than 1 billion organisms or more people on Earth. That actually comes from Rachel Carlson's book on Silent Spring. Pesticides, biocides that are sprayed onto soils are often fat soluble. So an ant may eat it. That's not a very fatty little guy, but an arthropod will come and eat that ant, and then what eats ants? Anteaters, or I don't know, beaver, like some other hairy, furry animal that has fat will come eat that thing, and then somebody else will come eat that thing. And the more higher up you go in the system, the more body mass and actual fat, that is when the multiplication of the harm of these poisons starts to happen. So identify which pests you have. Are they actually pests? Do they have another role that you're not aware of? And really go and follow Elaine Ingham, who can explain how the biology, what we're trying to do in our farms and gardens is create a bacteria factory. And generally those bacteria can sort out, that biology can sort out the things which are ailing your plants and crops. Yes, Chris Trump, absolutely. Chris is amazing. Korean natural farming, the whole gamut. He has gone to Korea, he has studied, he has amazing videos. on Korean natural farming. Again, using only, and this is, we didn't talk about circular economy and circular bioeconomy, but all the waste streams we have in cities, municipalities that can be converted into some funky biofertilizer. Like at home in my house, I live in an apartment. Being a chef, if I'm cooking crabs or oysters or octopus or calamari or whatever, goat skin in Dadaab refugee camp, I cut that stuff up, put it in a container, add lactobacillus serum, super easy to make with rice wash and raw milk, and add some sugar and just ferment it. When it stops smelling like Satan's outhouse, it's generally ready to go. So my mother's from Poland, my father was from Ukraine. I can ferment you, Zach. And this is, getting on that probiotic train of how organisms work, with fermentation, with soil, KNF, all of that. Matt Powers, yes, of course, Matt is great. And Matt also is, really filters and makes metabolizable a lot of the work that Elaine Ingham does. So Matt is fabulous. Chris. Insects eat weak dead and no plants.
I like this question from Philippides. He's coming from Greece. Let me scroll up to that question name. Okay, so greetings from Ebia Island, Greece. What about post-fire areas? Do you think the same strategy with swales and half moon should be deployed in areas right after a fire?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, Greece has really taken a beating with the wildfires. But again, yeah, that's such a context-specific question. Don't forget humans, before humans were farming crops, we were farming fire, right? We were fire farmers. We were practicing fire ecology and working with fire because it was shifting the nutrient cycles in our favor. It was attracting animals to us. So there, fire has a major role that has shifted the nutrient composition, the chemical composition of your crops. But it depends on where it is, really. It's so hard to make a blanket statement of yes, go do swales where you've had fires. But throughout the Mediterranean, temperatures are increasing. The indices across the entire Mediterranean rim are increasing. Water is becoming less accessible. And we have drying conditions, increasing temperatures. So what I would say is that don't forget, and if I didn't really hammer this point through in my presentation, moist soils are cool soils, okay? The more moisture you are retaining through evaporation, the soils will be cooler by half the degrees. In Chad, I had my temperature gun. The team couldn't believe it in the areas where we're doing water harvesting. So how we can support ecosystems to not just spontaneously combust is definitely through reinstating hydration, hydrology. But there's so many unknowns that I can't answer. So sorry. There's only so much I can respond to that one. I'm so scared to give some
That's perfect though.
advice, and then people do it, and then their country burns up, and they're gonna blame me.
And it's easy from afar to recommend the exact opposite wrong thing as the right thing. So I totally hear you there.
Afaristo Philippides.
Having so much experience, this question from Pipo, hope I'm saying your name right, sorry about that. Having so much experience in all these different landscapes, can you say something about the different types of soils and their behavior in water harvesting, specifically focusing in seasonal rains?
What I will say about that is that in the environments where I work, I either often have very sandy soils or very clay soils, like black cotton soil in South Sudan, where it is so impassable. I've literally seen a plane land and just get stuck in the mud. So don't forget that the biology will change your soil structure. So if you have very sandy soils, also read your weeds. Weeds are just an email from God or whoever, right? Telling you, yo, my guy, if you have sandy soils, or if you have a weed, which is no such thing, right? A weed is just a plant whose value we don't know and appreciate. If you have a wild plant that has all these tiny little hairline roots that's like trying to grab and hold together the soil, you have sandy unstructured soils. That's what the email from God said, or whoever. Sandy, if you have weeds or wild plants that have a very deep taproot, like a jackhammer trying to drill through, you may have compacted soils. So learning how to, and there's a book, what is it called? Something like Read Your Weeds or something catchy like that. But the answer to both is organic material. Organic matter feeds the biology. So if you have sandy soils and you start adding a lot of mulches and compost, the bacteria that are present in soils are going to start translating, converting organic material into globulin gels, into that stickiness. If you've ever seen like vermicompost or compost and you squeeze it and it holds its form, it's sticky. It's because all of those little people in the soil are pooping out glues, these special magical glues that are sticking to plants, sticking to roots, and they're what are creating those structures, the macro aggregates and micro aggregates in the soil. So if you have very, very sandy soil, the more you're adding mulches and compost, the more you're activating bacteria that are doing all their delicious magic and creating more soil structure. Likewise, in clay soils, the more organic material you're adding, the more those people in the soil are coming up and down. Just go to YouTube and search like earthworm time lapse or vermicompost time lapse, and you'll see these videos of how the earthworms are coming in and up and grabbing that organic material, taking it down into the ground. So they are structuring the soil. They are creating little tiny micro corridors where water and oxygen can enter and water can infiltrate, and they are the ones creating the structure of soil so that water can be, so it can be more porous. I feel like I'm being so long-winded. Sorry, guys.
No, you're doing great.
Sure, it's
Super.
great. Fantastic.
Yeah, super detailed answers. Really appreciated, I'm sure, by everybody. A little technical question. In a lot of the pictures you showed, you have this different little holes around the half moons. Could you give a little bit more into detail what these little holes are used for?
Yeah. So again, going back to the structure of the soils conversation, if you make a half moon in a clay condition, and it's for your fodder, for your animals, like let's say it's a grazeland, that water can be stagnant and soak for a very long time and become anaerobic. And then after a lot of time, you'll have grasses appear. If you are trying to grow sorghum or wheat or millet or maize, which is corn, in that same inside of the half moon, you can't do that because it's anaerobic. The water is catching inside the half moon and it's not sifting through the soil. It's stagnant and it stays on top of the soil and it becomes anaerobic, no oxygen. So you can't grow in that area. So in the half moons, you had many different types of styles. One can be a tree hole. If you're planting a tree in a half moon with very, very clay soil and you put a tiny little baby tree seedling inside the half moon and that water collects and doesn't pass through, you're going to get waterlogged and can kill or impact your tree seedling or your crop. So you are going to place the holes depending on the behavior of the water and the infiltration of water in the soil. So the hole, the planting, if you have a half moon and you are planting a tree, you might want to do the hole like above. So you have your seedling, the water will collect, but not waterlog the tree. Conversely, if you have a half moon in totally sandy soils, you might want to put your tree hole like right here because the water is going to pass through so quickly that you want to prolong the period of access that your root systems have to the moisture. So it really depends. you know, if you have the privilege of having your own land and your own system, try all of the above. Test, observe, start small, right? Observe, adapt. So, and don't forget that it can change. You can have 5 half moons on one landscape and they're all going to be different. So one could be closer to a ridge. One could be, you know, have some other geologic reality. So it's not a blanket statement that like this entire land is all, you know, it's all the same. Land and soils can change within a meter of each other. Slope, aggregate, you know, so many factors. A sump where there's a collection of silt, that could be a totally different reality than 5 meters away. So observe and test. Yeah.
Absolutely. And just to drive that point home, I always tell clients if what we implement looks exactly like the design, we have screwed up because we should be adapting it to based on what we're finding. Because like you're saying, you know, 1 meter away, stuff changes. And if you're not perceiving that as it's happening and adapting accordingly, you're going to make some really big mistakes.
Yeah, which is, you know, a lot of people use technology and GIS and to like these satellite level views of land to do designs. That's great, but I'm kind of, yeah, I've been living in Africa for 20 years. We don't always have a GIS, you know, like analyst or the technology to help design land. You literally have to ground truth everything. That's like you know, like you only have ground truthing. And not necessarily the satellite level tools.
Absolutely. I feel very similarly there. It's nice to have those tools, but I think you want to use them as an aid, not as a crutch. And I see a lot of people using them as a crutch where they can't design without the fancy satellite tools. And you'll miss some really key things that you would only find walking around on the landscape if that's the main part of your design process. And it's just so much more accessible to so many more people too. If you can just train people in what to see on the landscape, that's where the magic really starts happening.
Yeah, or train yourself to listen to the communities because often they already know, you know, what the reality is. They know it. Like for example, when Warren and I were doing the sponge village of Atego, we did one dam which was totally leaking, like, you know, no clay. The community knows where the clay is. They're like, you see that tree, take a right, and then go down that sump. And so that's where we were harvesting dump trucks full of clay in order to line and do track rolling, you know, to do the track compaction and seal the dam. So people know their context. They're the consultants, okay, of their context, of their landscape, of that area. So yeah.
100%. Do you have time for a couple more, Natalie? We got a bunch more, but we don't want to keep you too long here. You've been so generous already.
No worries.
Fantastic.
In a few minutes.
Yeah, we'll do a couple more here. From Daniel, in your experience, what's missing for scaling up this type of work?
You know, I don't know how to answer this. I always feel it's so funny when people are like, well, is this scalable? I'm like, literally to the planetary level, right? Like literally, you know, I think we're not doing new things here. We're just trying to unbleep what we have bleeped up, right? Like we're just trying to return our landscapes and our living planet to the condition that we found it. So I think the lack of understanding, people are focused on climate change and these sort of larger issues. That takes away from the fact that we have agency as individual human beings. Just to back the truck up for a second, climate change is real and it occurred because many people have been doing many small things. We can unbleep all of that by many people doing many small things. We may all die in the process, but we live to die another day, right? So the problem with scalability is the lack of understanding that people have. individualism. It depends on what culture you're talking about. I mean, I don't know if you're talking about the US or Guatemala or, but the culture that people have around collective action, around community efforts, is going to be very different depending on the context where you are. But to be honest, people just lack the understanding of hydrology, biology, ecology, bacteria in the soil. We are soil organisms. Zach, you're a soil organism. I'm a soil organism. We eat things that come from the soil. We poop things out. They're supposed to go back in the soil. And like, we don't understand how everything fits together, the interconnectedness. I've gone 3 times to India to study with Dr. Vandana Shiva. And I feel bad because I just feel like I end these calls with Raleigh and Zach with some like heavy gendered thing that pisses off a lot of men. But science tends to be this domineering, reductionist way of looking at the world, and it ignores the interconnectedness. So if you know Dr. Shiva and her talk about ecofeminism and the fact that Bacon had, modern science has been a male project, right? It's men have owned modern science. So no offense to the larger world, but it's just these are true things. And they take nature, parse it out into a reductionist way, into its different parts, but largely ignore the interconnectedness, the interdependence of the entire living system that we're in. So I feel like the biggest obstacle to scaling up these options is the human understanding of the living system that we are in, our planet as a living biotic pump, and not just like, oh, climate change, carbon. We can't talk about soil and carbon without talking about water. Like, all of these things were one conversation. So I feel that we're not prepared as children, at least in Western education, to understand that. And also our let me just say it this way, our economic system is a big impediment to that, right? To scaling up these efforts, because we are extracting, agriculture is a mining activity. We are actively mining minerals from the soil and don't understand our role in replenishing what we're taking out. So I think all of those things are impediments. I think having these calls, I think Raleigh and Zach, the work that you're doing, the way that you share it out, the way you try to bring these conversations together is really important. Knowledge is the main input. That is the exciting thing. It's also the disadvantage. Knowledge is the main input. There's everything available on YouTube. Go and learn, stay up until 4 a.m. drinking wine if you want, watching YouTube videos or do whatever you do. But, the information is free. It's accessible to us. We don't really have an excuse anymore. Knowledge is the main input, which again is the advantage and the disadvantage. You don't need external chemicals. You don't need fertilizers from Canada or Ukraine or China. You just need to be where you are and work with the flows of energy, nutrient, and cycles where you are.
Amen to that. I think so much of the issue with where we've gotten is just in not thinking about the interconnectedness of things and really focusing on one little myopic detail, disregarding all of the rest. And you have the worst actors being incentivized for their bad acting in that. And you have the disregarding of, the real knowledge and understanding of place, which I think we could say is largely feminine and largely indigenous too, in terms of these knowledge systems in particular. And it's really been cast aside. But you think, modern science took from whenever you want to call the start of modern science to now to understand that when indigenous cultures talk about forests calling rain, there's physical mechanisms that they're talking about in the forest calling rain. And you don't need to understand the bacteria and the biotic pump and all of that to understand that if you have vegetation, you'll have a more even climate. And so I feel like, we just kind of cast aside all knowing that was intuitive knowledge to slowly relearn it all. And we're still not back to the start yet. And in many cases, a lot of these local voices that have been living in the interconnection, they have all the answers already. We just need to elevate those voices and get more people educated about them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I agree with that.
I'm just thinking what a joke it is with a lot of the scientific focus where it's like, oh, we're gonna do direct carbon capture. We're gonna invest tens of billions of dollars in that. When meanwhile, people on tiny budgets, Tony Ronaldo, you and Warren Brush, World Food Program, achieve far greater result for like the tiniest fraction of what they're throwing away on a technology that does not work, or it's so expensive that it is a joke.
And gimmicky, right?
Yeah.
So like I have these Italian colleagues who I introduced the word gimmicky or gimmick, and they're like, but this is how do you say, what is the word gimmick? So yeah, I mean, I do get contacted all the time for people like, oh, I've got this magic pill that'll exceed cloud. I mean, I get contacted with a lot of people who are trying to do good, but I'm like, you're trying to commodify a biological function. And by the way, that is what modern agriculture is, right? It is, and this is going back to our education system. We are not allowed to know that the chemistry is produced by the biology. That's the long con of humanity, right? The chemistry is something you buy. It's a commodity. You go on Amazon and you put in your cart or whatever. And the chemistry is something you purchase, you buy it, and you apply it. Never are we allowed to know that if you feed the biology, if you nurture all of those tiny little engineers in the soil, they are pooping out the chemistry that you need. And, as I mentioned at home, I got all kinds of crazy things going on. I've got vermicompost. I had in my previous apartment, black soldier fly larvae. I had chicken compost on my balcony. I ferment everything. There's some funky stuff going on in here, but then I have it lab tested. And I have, I fermented eggshells. I fermented the shells of black soldier fly larvae. I have fermented goat skin, beehive wax, you name it. And when I get those lab results back, they're like, whatever you do not put this directly on the crops because it's so concentrated in nutrient, you will burn the crops. But every register of, whatever the chemical is, it is like very high, red, like, I made a video actually of my apartment balcony, the last apartment I lived in, and I showed the test results. I mean, you can ferment anything and extract that nutrient and turn it into a bioavailable product naturally, locally, without costs, and apply that. And like I said, that's the long con, is that we feel we've been allowed to think that our food is only a product of some capitalist extractive process, and that's just a fact-free way to be.
Absolutely. I think we can't top that. I think that's a good point to start wrapping this up, unless if you see any
Bueno.
really juicy ones, Raleigh.
Mucho
But yeah,
bueno.
that's just so on point. And I think this is, at the end of the day, a really empowering message too, because it means that all of us have all of the resources that we need to implement the solutions in our own lives that will also impact our communities, that as those communities impact one another, create a global impact. And everyone wants to have the silver bullet so that they get rich off of the silver bullet. But as soon as I hear like I have X, Y, and Z patented thing that I have exclusive rights to, it's like I am no longer interested in that product, service, or anything that you're doing with that, because this is nature. This is our commons that we share, not just as humans, but as all organisms on the planet. And so it's just the wrong way to look at it. But when we start to exist and participate with that commons, it gives back to us, 10x everything that we put into it.
Yeah, at WFP, we're like, oh, our biggest donor is US government or the Germans. I'm like, excuse me. I said to my director when I first started, I said, the soil is our biggest donor. We are the World Food Program. Like, our food is the thing that we distribute. Where does that come from? It's not the Americans. The soil is our biggest donor, and nature is our biggest partner. The biology is our biggest partner, right? So as I said, Dr. Shiva talks about, the intelligence of nature. working hand in hand with the intelligence of farmers in partnership over time, like that is the magic ticket, right?